Okay, we're good.
Okay, we're good? Okay, everybody stand for the pledge. Pledge allegiance
To the flag
of
of the United States of America,
America,
and to the republic
for
for which it stands,
stands
one
one
nation,
nation, under God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty
liberty
and
and
justice
justice
for all.
for all.
for all.
Please remain standing for a moment of silence. All right, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna turn it over to John O'Keefe. Remain
All
standing for silence.
I'm hearing back.
If anyone has YouTube up in the background, you just have to shut it
You have
off.
to turn that off. All right, so good evening, everybody. Hopefully everyone who's watching can see the presentation. It's been quite some time since we actually had a live presentation. Not that this is completely live, but at least it's an opportunity to go through where the spending plan is, as this is the plan that the board will look at to adopt this evening. So the timeline, obviously, because of the pandemic, has changed dramatically. Our budget adoption is this evening, May 20th. Next Wednesday, we'll be having a public hearing. And then on June 9th is the final day for the absentee ballots to be returned. That's our actual election and budget vote day. And as a reminder to everyone, you hopefully all received the yellow cards in the mail by now. The trustee election and the budget vote this year will be done by absentee ballot only. There'll be no voting at any of our buildings. An absentee ballot with the return envelope will be mailed to every resident, all 56,000 registered Sachem voters. They'll be going out next week, and we anticipate those ballots reaching you somewhere by the end of next week, on or about May 29th. You have until 5 p.m. June 9th to return that ballot. That ballot can't be postmarked by that date. It actually needs to be in the district clerk's hands by 5 p.m. that evening. So return them by mail, or if there's some last minute scenario, we will have people available to receive them on June 9th at district office up until 5 p.m. But after 5 p.m., all additional ballots will be rejected. And normally during a budget presentation, I would pause and ask the board in between each slide if there's any questions. Unfortunately, in this particular format, I really can't see you. So I'm going to go through the slides. There's only 8 of them. And at the end, I'll remove this from the screen and we can go through any questions before we go on to the meeting. So just to recap the tax levy, nothing's changed since we last spoke. At our last presentation, this was the levy that was proposed, and none of the numbers have changed since then. So this is just a simple way to demonstrate, how the levy goes from one year to the following year. The math behind it is a little bit more complex than this, but just looking at the numbers to see how you go from one year to the next and where that percentage increase comes from, I bulleted out with these 4 simple bullets. So you start with the current year's levy. That's the number you see up on top there, the $190,890,000. Then we are allowed to add to it a tax-based growth factor. That's the $439,000 that you see. That's a factor that's provided to us by the state of New York. That is the growth of assessed properties, brick and mortar growth within the district, growth of the tax base. So it could be new construction, or it could be renovations to existing property that increases its assessed value. The allowable levy growth factor is a 1.81% increase. That's the 2.3 million you see there. That's the 2% piece of the tax cap calculation. But this year, since the consumer price index was under 2%, you can only go what the CPI was, which was 1.81, and you don't get the full 2%. Change in pilots, those are our payments in lieu of taxes. Some of the properties don't pay property tax. They have contractual arrangements, through the local municipalities to pay pilots. Our pilots next year are going down by about $310,000, and you'll see them later in the revenue slide. So that increases the levy by that same amount because that money's falling off from one side of the revenue, it gets added to the other side. And the change in the capital tax levy, that's just a compilation of a variety of things like the district's debt, various capital projects, and then subtracted from that number is our building aid. So the net number is the $195,650,000 you see, which is a $4,760,000 or 2.49% increase year to year. And that's within the 2% cap. We're not exceeding the cap. Therefore, we only require a simple majority vote. Busy slide, a lot of information on there. All this information will be up on the website tomorrow, as are all the previous presentations. This just shows a historical perspective of our revenue as well as the projected revenue for next year. So our revenue is projected to increase by 1.87%. And over on the far right column, you show the different revenue streams that we anticipate receiving next year. So that $195 million you see up on top, that's the tax levy. The next piece are those pilots. We're anticipating about $890,000, whereas this year we received about 1.2 million. And there's a variety of other little categories along the way, student fees, that could be for driver's ed, AP exams, et cetera, things that the students pay for to the district, field trip related fees, tuition to other districts, from other districts. In other words, districts send their children to Sachem programs and we collect tuition from them, our interest and earnings on our various holdings, rent of district properties, rent from other governments. That 1.5 million is all the rents we receive from Eastern Suffolk BOCES for the Sequoia property and Tecumseh. Then we have a variety of miscellaneous revenue sources. Then we have the state aid, and there you'll see that 125.2 million. And you'll see that's a dramatic drop from the current year, which is 128.8. So now we've gotten a couple of different numbers from the state. If we go back in time to January, when you got the executive budget, we anticipated basically the same amount of aid. It was almost flat, 128.8. And then normally, I'm sorry, it was 128.7, slightly less. And then normally through the budget process, once both sides of the House hammer things out, they meet with the governor, they come to consensus. Usually schools see a little bit more. But unfortunately on April 1st, we were already in the throes of the pandemic. They did convene, they did pass a budget, but they reduced the budget. So our aid on April 1st was 128 million, almost flat. So we lost about $800,000. And then since that date, we've heard over and over again from the governor, first him talking about cutting our budget by upwards of 50%, and now talking by cutting it upwards of 20%. And each quarter, we're supposed to get a revision in state aid. He was supposed to revise those numbers first for us on May 1st. That day came and went, and unfortunately, we got no news. Then we were next told we would see that information this past Friday on the 15th of May, and again, no news. So we need to move forward with the information we have at hand. So you will see we did lower that projection to the 125.2. And that's because we know that we won't be receiving as much transportation aid that's in the budget, because we know that we're not paying for transportation these last 3 months of the year. Therefore, the state is not going to aid us on it next year. So that's why you see that number a little bit lower than you may have seen it in previous presentations. Then we just get some Medicaid money, and then we are going to appropriate some fund balance. Basically, the money that we're saving by not paying the transportation for these last few months, we're going to appropriate $3.9 million, and we're going to appropriate $935,000 from our teacher retirement system reserve to balance out the budget. But again, this budget is supported by a 2.49% tax levy increase, which is tax cap compliant. Down at the bottom, you also see the note there about the transportation aid reduction. The state aid numbers might change again, but unfortunately, we may not know what those numbers are until after the budget has actually been voted on, which is a little bit disconcerting. Just summing up the expenditure budget, Now, of course, the two budgets have to balance, which you see they will. Total proposed budget for next year is a 1.87% increase, $333,362,000. And you've seen the budget presentations before. There are upwards of 700 unique account codes that comprise our budget. But in this slide, we just sum it down to the 6 major categories. So the top is general support. So that's everything non-related to instruction. That's the business office, that's facilities, that's grounds, legal expenses, insurance, all things of that nature. Obviously you see there, the budget is basically flat. It's actually a slight reduction. Move down to the next line, which is instruction. That's the bulk of our budget. That's both general education, special education, athletics, co-curriculars, everything along those lines. You see the budget growth there by a little over $5.5 million. Transportation growth, just shy of $2 million. Part of that growth, normally year to year, we would see that somewhere in the range of about 2% or so, because it is controlled by its own CPI calculation. But this year we are going out to an RFP, for transportation, and we do anticipate there might be a slight increase there. Benefit costs are relatively flat. Primary reason for that, even though TRS expenses are going up, we did have a year which was highly unusual this year where health insurance actually had a slight reduction. So that slight reduction helps carry forward into the following year to keep that number a little bit lower for us. Debt service, those are all our bond debt payments. You see a dramatic drop there. It's going from the 18.5 million to the 15.8 million. So there's some savings there in the budget. And that savings was known that it was going to occur this year. And it's part of our multi-year plan to perform capital projects without going out for bonds. So you'll see on the interfund transfers, that's the category of the budget where we both pay for capital projects for the given year, bus purchase for the year, and it's also the money that we set aside to run our summer special education program. That's growing by about $1.8 million this year. And that was part of our multi-year plan to start easing into various capital projects without having to burden the taxpayer by going out with more bond campaigns where we would have to structure that debt over 20 to 30 years and incur all those interest costs. So just some highlights. This budget maintains all district staffing at this time to support our students' needs. The only additional teaching staff in this particular budget are 2 E&L teachers based on enrollment needs. Staffing for next year is still a work in progress. Normally it would probably be summed up for the most part by now, but it was hampered by the fact that obviously children are not in the buildings. It's difficult for them to meet with guidance counselors, et cetera. So there might be still some tweaks, but any changes that will be made will be made within those constraints of the approved budget. Now, the budget is built with the flexibility to absorb some level of reduction, and I've discussed that with the board. Obviously, if there's some draconian cuts or something that, beyond what we're expecting, I'll keep the community apprised. I'll sit with the board and we'll work out the next steps on that, but fingers crossed. Next section, we just talk about, continued replacement of equipment throughout the district. We know for years the district suffered without replacement of equipment district-wide, whether it was computers, things of that nature, facilities, trucks, athletic equipment, et cetera. We have equipment in all departments throughout the year. This is just a sampling. It's more smart boards, more projectors, large format printers. There's money set aside for the radio station transmitter, a drone program. There'll be drones purchased for student use, PC workstations district-wide, and additional computer carts and devices for the children. Athletics, just some miscellaneous equipment this year, some hockey goals, lacrosse goals, some portable bleachers for our middle school families when they come to watch a game, some turtle cages for baseball, and some volleyball net systems. And then the additional monies that I said going towards capital projects. The last few years we've been checking things off in a manner where first we're hitting all the health and safety items. There was various things that we were cited by the Office of Civil Rights, ADA, EPA with fuel tanks and things like that. Those items are all done. And now we're trying to get to the building envelopes and important things like that. Most of the buildings in the district need some form of roof replacement or repair. So the first one on the list next year is Sagamore. Going to be doing the large main section of the building known as the H wing, as well as the 8th grade wing, as well as the entire H wing at Samoset. We're going to also renovate and enlarge the hallway bathrooms at Sagamore. And that'll be a project that we'll look in the following year to also duplicate at Seneca, because we do know at secondary level, we need bathrooms in all the buildings. While we're doing that bathroom renovation at Sagamore, we're going to renovate the cafeteria storage and do some reconfiguration in the little theater room to create more storage. And again, we're on our continued replacement of school buses. There'll be 6 additional buses. I believe 2 more years out, we'll have completely changed over the entire fleet. And then we can start the process of planning down the road, with the 12 to 15-year life on school buses. At least we won't get to the point like it was when we first took over several years ago, where the district had a bus fleet of 18 to 22-year-old buses. And unfortunately, none of them had been replaced in quite some time. The next thing, which is also important, is the capital reserve. Last year, the voters overwhelmingly approved the ability for the district to set aside monies. And again, this was for the purpose so we could do capital projects without the need to bond. So the way the reserve was set up, each year, if we have sufficient surplus, we're able to take up to $6 million of that surplus and put it in this reserve specifically for capital projects. So for next year, we plan to go to the voters because the voters both have to set this reserve up and the voters also have to approve the spending from this reserve. And the great thing about this reserve is there's no impact on the tax levy. So voting for this doesn't increase your taxes. There's no additional cost. But the real bonus is we still get building aid on all eligible projects. And most projects done on school buildings in Sachem, we receive 76 cents back on every dollar we spend. So spending $6 million, we're going to see over time, it's a 15-year period, they'll return to us $4.5 million. So that's very important. Now you'd get aid if this was through a bond, but through a bond, you're taking money, you're borrowing it, and you're taking 20 years to pay it off at interest rates. And even though interest rates are attractive, we know from what our annual debt payments look like that it does add up. So just a quick rundown of the projects. A lot of big ticket items for things that are at the end of their useful life. The high school east track, the turf field itself needs to be replaced. On the back side of east, there was never a retaining wall installed by the visitor side of the grandstands. When the building was first built, there were troubles where the hillside washed down into the neighbor's property on Sachem Road there. So we want to shore that up and get that fixed properly because there's actually no walkway to the visitor stands. They washed away when the hill collapsed. High School East also has some fire alarm upgrades that we want to do. High School North will be doing a turf replacement. High School North, just like we're doing this year at Seneca and Sagamore, we'll be replacing their lockers, which are all original. The main chimney at North requires reconstruction. The masonry is collapsing and the main cap is coming in. There's some miscellaneous drainage improvements near the rear loading dock because that does pool up with water. Sagamore running track, the rubberized surface had failed many years ago. The district didn't have the funds at the time to have the track repaired. So they ground the rubber off and they've maintained it as best as possible, filling in the cracks and sealing it and striping it. But the asphalt surface is badly deteriorated and there is no rubberized surface. So this would require us to mill that surface off, replace the asphalt and install new rubberized track. And the Sagamore band room is not ADA compliant. So we'd reconfigure that. And these projects here total nearly $6 million. So you'll see this on your ballot as Proposition 2. So as you're voting for the main budget, there'll be a second item asking you yes or no, do you approve the expenditures from this reserve? And hopefully you see the value in utilizing the reserve. That really wraps up my presentation. I'm going to pull down the screen now. Next Wednesday, we'll meet again for the budget hearing, and I'll just be doing basically a slightly modified version of this presentation as required by law. And then the budget vote, as we said earlier, is June 9th by absentee ballot only. There is no voting in any of the buildings. So as I pull the screen back, do we have any questions from the board that I can help you with? Mr. Kearney.
John, just out of curiosity, the $5.5 million increase in instruction, is that all contractual or is that also additional staff?
The only additional staff, like we said earlier, was just the E&L teachers. Some of it's contractual and some of it is increased costs in the special ed area. When we spoke about that particular part of the budget, which seems like months ago now, back in probably late February, I assume, we went over some of those BOCES placements and how they were projecting a larger number, which was adding several $1 million to that particular section of the budget.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is there anyone else that I could help?
John,
It's
it's
out.
Dorothy. It's Dorothy.
Okay, yes.
Hi, I have a question about the, as far as back in February, we had talked about adding in those 35 positions. So we're not doing that. The only new positions are the 2 E&L in this presentation, correct?
Correct. I thought with the situation at hand, with us not being certain what the financial picture would look like, it'd be prudent not to add those positions this time. The E&L positions will be required, based on student enrollment. Certainly if Dr. Morrow comes back to me over the summer and things aren't as they project, we'll certainly adjust for that. But right now we project that we'll need those 2 FTEs.
All right, one other question. As far as the capital projects that you had on there in the beginning of the presentation, are any of those projects being done by our in-house employees or is it all contracted out?
It'll be primarily contracted out. The scale of the work is just too great for the staff in the short window of time. Because you have to remember, most capital projects need to be completed in that small window when you're closed for the summer. The voters approved the projects that we're only just starting on now last May. You apply to the state after the voters approve them, you let them doing the project, you send up your architectural plans. It takes upwards of 40 weeks for them to review them and give you a final sign off. So literally those lockers and those science classrooms and everything else that the voters approved last May, we only got our building permits over the last 2 or 3 weeks. So the last few weeks, I gave the board a list. We're writing the purchase orders for those things and we're lining up the vendors to literally start as soon as the staff and the students have removed all their belongings from the school. We've had the year-end textbook retrieval and things of that nature, because at the 3 middle schools, there's going to be considerable construction going on. You're having new auditoriums done at Sagamore and Seneca. You're having lockers removed, so every hallway is going to be busy under construction. Samoset is having 8 classrooms that'll be completely gutted and renovated. So there'll be 5 new science labs, which is very exciting. And 3 of our life skills rooms will actually be designed for special education students.
Okay, and then as far as the transportation, the busing, so we saved what, around $4.5 million?
From the time, from April 1st to June 30th, yes, approximately.
Okay, and then as far as the state aid, you touched on that a little bit. So I've been watching some of the news presentations that Cuomo does each day. So like you said, he's gone anywhere from saying he can cut state aid by 50%, 20%, 10%. So even if we take something and say 10%, if he cuts it by 10%, what is that, about $12 million?
When he's targeting our aid, and he's not been specific, so this is just purely professional opinion among business officials and superintendents, we believe he is only talking about foundation aid. We do not believe he's talking about expense-based aids. So our foundation aid is about $89 million. So 10% would be just shy of 9 million.
which is still huge. $9
Still
million
huge,
cut, we would.
But the
we
spending
would have
plan
to-
was designed in such a way that should we learn that, we're going to be holding back on moving forward with some expenditures, like some of the great equipment that we just spoke about. I would pause on that for July 1, whereas normally we would try to get those purchase orders going right away. My recommendation would be we pause on as much as we can. Let's get a clearer picture of where we stand. And let's just make sure that we're ready, because it's still unknown what September is going to look like. So we may
Right.
incur costs that we're not even aware of yet with school reopening. So I want to, retain as much funding as possible to be utilized to get schools back up and running.
So if he decides to cut by 10%, that's about 8 or 9 million. Obviously, 20%, you're looking at about $18 million, which is, and that might be a conservative amount if he's talking about 40 or 50%. But John, Albany can decide to cut that at any point, right? Just like they did with the gap elimination, they have presented that to the districts and said, listen, you have to live with that now. And the 2% was implemented shortly after that. So because even though it was passed, he could still cut it at any point, correct?
Yeah, this is an unusual, each year our state aid gets adjusted during the year. Because even the aid that gets passed in the budget on April 1st by the state is based on projections we've placed into our financial statements that we've done from the year before. So obviously the year is not finalized yet. Once the year is finalized and the ST3 is filed, they use those actual numbers and they revamp. So even the number we were provided last April was reduced by over $1 million during the year, which is not uncommon. And yes, $1 million's a big number, but it's something that we can absorb within a budget of over $300 million.
Right. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Piccarello, I believe.
Yeah, just a quick question. I think the whole board and the community, for that matter, is under the same mindset that we can never have the 16,000 left in reserves that we did at one point. But if you look at the reserves now, we're upwards of $53 million. I was just wondering if you could just do a quick sum up of why it's important to have the money at the level that it is and what it's actually used for.
Yeah, I wish I had a slide actually to show the community, because it's easier to see it. Because people hear fund balance and reserves and they think it's just one pot of money.
Just stashed aside.
Correct. It's actually several different reserves that have very specific purposes. For example, the capital reserve. The voters authorized us to establish a capital reserve with the specific purpose of us putting money aside if there was monies left at the end of the year for the purposes of repairing and maintaining our facilities without having to go out and bond money again, which led Sachem, unfortunately, down a long financial path that we're still about a dozen years or so away from paying off. So that particular reserve can only be used for those monies. With that, we also have an employer retirement system reserve. So obviously, the staff is divided into two categories. We have certificated staff, which is your teaching staff, administrators, and then you have your civil service staff. The different sides of staff are in two different retirement systems. We're allowed to reserve funds to set aside to pay for those obligations, because each year the amount that we pay changes. It's driven primarily by the stock market. So unfortunately, next year, we'll probably be looking at very large increases in employer contribution percentages. But those reserves allow us to put monies aside. So where there are those big spikes year to year, we have monies in the reserves. If the numbers stay the same year to year, it'd be rather easy to budget. But if you get a large percentage spike year to year, that reserve allows us to take those monies and offset that. And the budget doesn't have peaks and valleys. For example, in this year, we're appropriating $900,000 from the teachers' retirement system reserve, which is equivalent to the increase that we're seeing this year, last year to this year. You have reserves for employee benefit payments. So certain unions, upon separation from the district, are entitled to certain payouts for whether it be vacation, sick time, things of that nature. You wouldn't want in a particular year, a large number of employees to go out and your budget not be prepared for that. That reserve sets aside the monies to pay for those obligations when they come due. So each of them has a specific name. There's only one category, what the governor usually calls our rainy day fund, called unassigned fund balance. Unassigned fund balance, you're allowed to hold up to 4% of your budget in that reserve. And again, it's a large number because we're Sachem and we have a large budget. So it's $13 million when it's fully funded. But that $13 million just 5 short years ago was only 16,000. So the board has worked very, very hard over the last 4 years rebuilding that reserve. At the time when I took over in the district in my particular position, we were on the state controller's list of districts in severe fiscal stress. And it took us a few years to get off, but for now 2 years in a row, we are not on that fiscal stress list. And the reason we are is because we have sufficient reserves set aside to handle our obligations. So I hope that helped answers your question.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Can I help anybody else? No? Madam President, I guess the floor is yours.
Okay, business items, adoption of the 2020-21 budget. May I please have a motion?
Motion.
Sarah, second. Bill, any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion is carried. Now we're up to adjournment. May I please have a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Bill, second.
Second.
Meredith? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, have a good night, everybody.
See
Good
you
night.
next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Take care.